Well, great to be with you this morning. And yeah, that's the very first time I've ever been to a Bible study that opened with "Take Me Out to the Ball Game." That was extraordinary. And thank you for doing that, Diana. And we'll close today singing "Go Cubs, Go." But that'll be John Goodman. Actually, it really wouldn't be fair because my Cleveland Indian dear brother, John Fuller, is over here. And no, it's all good for John. He can sing "Take Me Out to the Ball Game" and insert tribe. Yeah, that's right. So it's all good. And just to, evidence of the greatness of the gospel is that John and I are just really good friends. So so it's all good. And it's not like it's Auburn, Alabama or something. I mean, then it would not even the gospel can transcend that, I'm pretty sure. So right. Well, so you have a new study guide. I hope you've picked that up. And again, we'll be here in this room for a couple of weeks. Randy, we are videotaping, right?
Correct.
Good news. Okay. Because I'm going to be busy this evening. And I will not be teaching here tonight. It will be by video. So I will be otherwise occupied. Just saying. Just saying. There's priorities. I will be at a prayer vigil. That's right. That's right. I'll be on my face praying to heaven for hell to freeze. I think that's the right lyric for that one. So what you have in your study guide, we'll be using this one probably for 2 weeks. We turn to a whole new section of Isaiah. We've covered 1 through 12, which is a particular section within the larger prophetic text. And the next section is Isaiah 13 to 27. Now, in the first section, he has turned his attention to Judah and Israel. It begins with the year that King Uzziah dies, the leprosy that resulted from the arrogance of the kings moving into the sanctuary to offer incense, the judgment that is. Hey, Doug. And yeah, it's all right. It's all right. Yeah, it's okay. It's all right. And Doug Cavender, major Cleveland Indians fan as well. So it's, hey, it just comes down to one. It's all good, right? It's all good. That's where we want to be. So in this section, the attention turns from Judah and Israel to their neighbors, to the surrounding nations. And if you look at the structure I've put at the very top of your study guide here, this chiastic structure, you'll remember what that literary structure is communicating to us. These are literary markers that guide us through the section. This was an ancient form of communication, and it's an underlying literary structure in the text. And if you just look at that, look at point 1, all right? Fall of Babylon. Look at the bottom. Fall of Babylon. Look in the middle. Fall of Babylon. What's this section about? The fall of Babylon. Right. That's what this whole section is about. Now, there are other nations which are in view for Isaiah in terms of his prophetic ministry. Moab is in view. Egypt and Ethiopia. Egypt and Shebna. Tyre is in view. These are the surrounding nations for Israel, and they represent threats. Now, who isn't in view here in particular are the Assyrians. The Assyrians, when Isaiah is prophesying, are the immediate threat in terms of an international power. So Isaiah is, by the very nature of this prophecy, saying something about the distant future. He's saying something about what is to come. Because the threatening power of the day is going to be Assyria. Babylon's going to come much later. But his words are words of caution and deep warning about the Babylonian threat. And when we get to the middle of Isaiah, we'll see a great hinge, a great turning in the historical chapters. in the historical chapters, which are centered right in the middle of the book, the prophecies on both sides of them, it begins with the Assyrians showing up and then being turned away. And when they're turned away, and this is when Hezekiah is king, emissaries from Babylon, ambassadors from Babylon come, and they come. And Hezekiah shows them everything. And Isaiah comes and he goes, who were those men? And he goes, well, those were just ambassadors from Babylon. And what did you show them? Well, I showed them everything. And then Isaiah says, well, the day's coming when they're going to come with, and they're going to take everything that they saw. So we'll get to that section in the middle of Isaiah. So there's from an historical and international geopolitical standpoint, there's going to be a movement from Assyria, the capital was Nineveh, to the Babylonians. So this section deals with this really future threat. And that tells us something, because it'd be very easy for the people of the time to simply go, well, that's a long way off. It doesn't really affect me. Why is that important? And the reason it's important is because Babylon is more in Scripture than simply a place. It's not simply a geographical location, somewhere with coordinates on your GPS. It is certainly that, but it's more than that. And this is what sets up the initial section of our study, which we're simply going to call the prophetic imagination. Now, how many of you were in the John study, the Gospel of John? Okay, so not so many. For those of you who were, you'll know how this works. One of the things that happens in Scripture is the use of sign language. Now, sign language is meant to point us towards the ultimate reality. The sign is not the thing, but there is a connection between the sign and the thing signified. So, for instance, I would stand up at the front on a communion Sunday and take bread and say the words of institution. Jesus said, take and eat, this is my, take and drink, this is my blood. And you don't think, well, you don't go immediately to a medieval understanding of transubstantiation, and it's been changed in its substance into the body and into the blood. That's not where you go. You think, and rightly, it's a sign of the thing. But what you don't do, I trust, is reduce that by saying it's a sign. You don't, by that, go reductionistic and say symbol. Because symbol means that it's simply an identification with, but it doesn't communicate the reality. All right, there's what's called I'm going to use a theological term now, a sacramental union between sign and thing signified. That's how we identify. So when we say the bread is the body, we don't mean that the bread has been changed into the body. But we do say that in a mystery, when you receive the bread by faith, you are receiving what? The body. You're not just getting a memory jog, like, oh yeah, remember something way in the distant past. Try to remember that you actually don't have a personal memory of. Remembrance doesn't work that way in sacramental language. I don't want to get off on sacraments this morning. I could do that, but we don't want to do that. But you have to remember that when a sign is given in the Scripture, signs are language which communicate reality. Signs have two characters. Sometimes they're miraculous, and sometimes they're simply everyday occurrences. So, the very first time the word signs and wonders, that phrase shows up in the Bible, is in the book of Exodus. And it's about the plagues on Egypt. When you and I think of the term signs and wonders, we think miracles that are good and beautiful and amazing. But how did the Egyptians feel about it? When the Nile turns to blood, that's a sign, but it's not something that's communicating healing. It's a sign that's communicating judgment. It's judgment. Right, so signs and wonders cut both ways. So when the Bible speaks of sign language, it can be something miraculous. The river, the Nile River turns to blood. It can also be everyday events and things in the creation which are used by the prophets poetically. This is a sign. Now, sign language has already shown up in the first section of Isaiah. Remember, Isaiah comes to Ahaz and he says, ask the Lord for a sign. And he says, well, I'm not going to ask for a sign. He says, well, the Lord himself will give you a sign. Behold, the virgin will conceive and bear a son. And then, remember, Isaiah says about his sons, behold, I and the children whom the Lord has given me are for signs and wonders in Israel. So the children themselves are signs, and that's why they have those names. Now the children, those two sons, aren't miracles, and their names aren't miraculous, but their names point. That's what a sign does. If you're driving down the interstate and you see a sign by the road that says Nashville, you don't stop and get out and go, I thought it was bigger than this. All right, what does the sign do for you? It tells you something. What is it saying to you? It's saying to you, keep going. You're on the right road. You're moving in the right direction. The sign is pointing towards that which is signified. That's what a sign does. So when we talk about signs, we have to remember that there are miraculous signs, like a healing, somebody being raised from the dead, and there are also very natural events. Isaiah has his sons, and they're for signs and for wonders. Okay. In this part of Isaiah, there is a kind of sign language which is employed, which is the prophet gathering emblems up, particularly from the book of Genesis. And in there, he's in a certain sense borrowing the language of Genesis. Remember, Isaiah stands in the middle of Israel's redemptive history, and he points back in order to do what? To point forward. So he's going to reach back over here again, and he's going to use this language to describe God's actions that are coming. So while Babylon is real and a real threat, it is more than that. In the Bible, Babylon becomes a sign. It becomes a sign language about a particular existence, a way that things occur. Here's a second sign that if you just look through this briefly in this section of notes, Babylon is a sign. The heavens themselves are a sign in Isaiah's prophetic imagination. What happens to stars and moon and suns? He himself is a sign. And then finally in Isaiah 27, the sign of the serpent. The sign of the serpent. So what I want to do this morning is just take a quick look at those four, they're not the only ones, but these four areas of sign language, all right? So let's take those. So if you look at Isaiah 13, let's turn there, Isaiah 13, and look at verse 1. Isaiah 13, verse 1. The burden or the oracle concerning Babylon, which Isaiah the son of Amoz saw. So that language introduces a whole new literary section. The burden of the word of the Lord concerning Babylon. This is a new section. Lift up a standard on the bare hill, raise your voice to them, wave the hand that they may enter the doors of the nobles. I have commanded my consecrated ones, I have even called my mighty warriors, my proudly exulting ones, to execute my anger, a sound of tumult on the mountains, like that of many people, a sound of the uproar of kingdoms, of nations gathered together. The Lord of hosts is mustering the army for battle. They are coming from a far country, from the farthest horizons, the Lord and his instruments of indignation to destroy the whole land. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. Therefore all hands will fall limp and every man's heart will melt. They will be terrified. Pains and anguish will take hold of them. They will writhe like a woman in labor. They will look at one another in astonishment, their faces aflame. Behold, the day of the Lord is coming, cruel, with fury and burning anger, to make the land a desolation, and he will exterminate its sinners from it. For the stars of heaven and their constellations will not flash forth their light. The sun will be dark when it rises, and the moon will not shed its light. And thus I will punish the world for its evil, the wicked for their iniquity. I will put an end to the arrogance of the proud and abase the haughtiness of the ruthless. I will make mortal man scarcer than pure gold, and mankind than the gold of Ophir. Therefore I will make the heavens tremble, and the earth will be shaken out of its place at the fury of the Lord of hosts in the day of his burning anger. So this is a prophecy about coming judgment, and I want you to notice that it concerns two particular signs. The first one is Babylon itself, the sign of Babylon. This is the burden of the Lord concerning Babylon. And then at the bottom, he talks about the stars and the moon and the sun, the constellations, and what happens to them. Well, let's look through this Babylonian one. You've read those verses. Let's look over at chapter 21 for just a moment. Isaiah 21. Now, if we go over to chapter 21, you're going to, in particular, the first several verses, you're going to see another word about women in the anguish of childbirth. Now, in the first chapter, in chapter 13, you have Babylon coming as an army, and the land, the people of the land they're invading, they are the ones who are in anguish. They're the ones who are in labor pains. In Isaiah 21, let's look over there. The oracle concerning the wilderness of the sea, as windstorms in the Negev sweep on, it comes from the wilderness, from a terrifying land. A harsh vision has been shown to me. The treacherous one deals treacherously, and the destroyer still destroys. Go up, Elam, lay siege, Media, for I have made an end of all the groaning she has caused. All right, so there's somebody coming under judgment for causing groaning. Now, for this reason, my loins are full of anguish. Pains have seized me like the pains of a woman in labor. I am so bewildered I cannot hear, so terrified I cannot see. My mind reels, horror overwhelms me. The twilight I longed for has been turned for me into trembling. They set the table, they spread out the cloth, they eat, they drink. Rise up, captains, oil the shields. For thus says the Lord to me, go, station the lookout, let him report what he sees. When he sees riders, horsemen in pairs, a train of donkeys, a train of camels, let him pay close attention, very close attention. And then the lookout called, O Lord, I stand continually by day on the watchtower. I'm stationed every night at my guard post. Now behold, here comes a troop of riders, horsemen in pairs. And one said, fallen, fallen is Babylon, and all the images of her gods are shattered to the ground. So in chapter 13, Isaiah is the invading army. But here in chapter 21, Isaiah is the land that is invaded, and it falls. Now, is this the only time in the Bible you see or hear the words, fallen, fallen is Babylon? No. Where else do you see that, Mark? In the book of Revelation. Fallen, fallen is Babylon. Now, of course, Babylon as a city at the time of the book of Revelation doesn't exist. It's something completely different, because Babylon is a sign. Babylon is not simply a place or a kingdom. It becomes something which is symbolic. But let's look over to chapter 24. If you, again, kind of pick up the whole scene here. Now, we won't read all of chapter 4 through 27, but I do want you to pick up on just a sense of this. Chapter 24, verse 1, behold, the Lord lays the earth waste, devastates it, distorts its surface, and scatters its inhabitants. And the people will be like the priest, the servant like his master, the maid like her mistress, the buyer like the seller, the lender like the borrower, the creditor like the debtor. The earth will be laid waste and completely despoiled, for the Lord has spoken this word. And the phrase there is the same one that's used from the book of Genesis, formless and void. The earth will be formless and void. It's decreation. All right? So God's judgment is going to look like creation thrown into reverse. It goes away from culture and away from beauty, and it goes back to being formless and void. It's the same language that's used in Genesis chapter 1. So what's he talking about? Well, he's talking about, if you read through the rest of the section here, he's talking about Babylon and its fall, all the way through chapter 27. And he calls Babylon something in chapter 27, verse 1, which is another symbol. And we'll come to it. Look at 27, verse 1. In that day, the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, with his fierce and great and mighty sword, Leviathan, the twisted serpent, and he will kill the dragon who lives in the midst of the sea. Well, how many of you believe in sea monsters and sea dragons? Well, you're not sure. Well, I'm sure I buy sea monsters and dragons that live in the sea. What's this about? Why is God saying he's going to kill a dragon that comes from the sea? Well, is this the only time that you see a dragon rising from the sea in the Bible? Well, no, it shows up again. Is the only time Leviathan is mentioned? Well, no. So there's a connection between Babylon and Leviathan and the dragon that lives in the sea and the oppression of God's people and God coming with a sword to pierce the dragon that comes from the sea and deliver his people from the power of Babylon. Now see, if I handed you a worksheet this morning and said, here's what we're going to look at. We're going to look at God piercing the dragon and delivering his people and destroying the power of the serpent, you would think, what are we going to hear a lesson about? You'd say, well, this is kind of book of Revelation stuff. This is apocalypse stuff. And it's about the devil, but we never mentioned the devil, did we? But we use language which we associate with him because of the word dragon. But the word dragon associated with Satan is the language of the book of Revelation. But all that language in the book of Revelation has its roots right here in this section of Isaiah, which is about the judgment of God on Babylon. That's why the book of Revelation is so full of the language of Babylon's overthrow and the destruction of the dragon and Leviathan, the dragon that lives in the sea. So this is sign language. So yeah, there's a real geopolitical empire which is going to come up on the horizon. Back in 13, it says it's on a distant horizon, and God's going to judge it. But God, in judging that empire, is creating, if you will, a kind of prototype for the way in which God always overthrows the enemies of his people. Babylon is a sign of everything that is detestable in God's sight, especially in reference to how they oppress God's people. Now, again, this goes all the way back to Genesis, because Babylon has its origins in the book of Genesis with a man named Nimrod. Now, let's talk about him for just a minute. From Nimrod, who was the emperor of a city. What was the name of the city? Babel. Babel. Now, Nimrod, it says, very interesting, this is all in Genesis 10 and 11, was a mighty hunter before the Lord. That's how most English translations say it. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord. But the word in Hebrew means against. He was a mighty hunter against God. He was an anti-theist. And he believed, as the Babylonians did, in a panoply of gods. And in this panoply of gods, they believed that it was their responsibility to rise towards them. So they built a ziggurat, right? That tower to, it says, reach to the heavens. Now, if you go back and you read in Genesis, it says that the reason they built the tower, it says this, to keep us from being spread abroad and to make a name for ourselves. To make a name for ourselves. And then they built it out of, did they build it out of stone? No. They built it out of bricks. Now, if you want a 3-point sermon on three ingredients for why you should never build a church, that would be a great sermon. Here's three things about never building a church. You should never build a church. Here's the 3 Babylonian reasons. All right. we want to keep from being spread around. Don't spread us around. All right, here's the second thing. We want to make a name for ourselves. It's all about who? It's all about us. We don't want to be spread around. We want to be well thought of. We want to be famous. And then it says, and we all want to be alike, because they made it not out of stone, who makes stones? God makes stones. Who makes bricks? Man makes bricks, and he makes them all the same. So if you want to build a church so that you reverse the Great Commission and you become famous and everybody looks the same, right? That's inviting God's judgment. So they built their tower. And they did it with great unity, and God, it says, came down, and he saw them, and he saw that because they were unified, nothing would be impossible to them. And so he came down, and he judged it. And what was the form of judgment it took? Language judgment. Language judgment. Now, I want you just to make a note about that in your notes here about language judgment. The confusion of languages, the multiplying of tongues, was a sign of judgment. Judgment. Why is that important? Well, whenever God brings judgment, from that moment on, he will create a situation in which people hear multiple foreign languages. It's always a sign of judgment. You can go to Deuteronomy, and there's that section about Deuteronomy 27 and 28 about the blessing and the curse. And Deuteronomy 28 is a lengthy chapter, and it goes into, here's all the curses, all right? One of the curses is this: you will be carried away into exile, and there you will no longer hear your tongue, you will hear what? Foreign tongues. I will speak to this people by foreign tongues. Well, guess who picks up that language from Deuteronomy? Isaiah. Isaiah does. Isaiah picks up that language. It's over in chapter 28. You can just turn over a page there and have a look at it. Might as well chase this rabbit a little bit this morning because you're kind of going, what? Okay, so in Isaiah 28, in this particular passage, God comes to Israel and begins to deal with them in terms of judgment. And it's very interesting how it works out. In verse 14, therefore hear the word of the Lord, you scoffers who rule the people who are in Jerusalem, because you've said we've made a covenant with death, and with Sheol we've made a pact. The overwhelming scourge will not reach us when it passes by, and so on. I'm going to lay in Zion a stone, a tested cornerstone, right, for a firm foundation, and he who believes in it will not be disturbed. So there's that promise about the new cornerstone that's coming. What's that a prophecy about, right? That's about Christ as well. Now, what you discover is that in this particular oracle about the coming judgment that God will bring about, the Lord also prophesies his judgment upon them. In Isaiah 28, let me just make sure I get the right verses for you here. I got to check this particular text over here. In verse 11, let's go back a few words here. Verse 11, indeed, he will speak to this people through stammering lips and a foreign tongue. So the cornerstone is coming, but at the time of the cornerstone coming, there will also be God speaking to his people through what? Stammering lips and a foreign tongue. Now that's tied back to Deuteronomy 28. Deuteronomy 28 is you'll go into judgment and you'll hear a foreign tongue. Okay, so Isaiah says, the day is coming when I'm going to speak to this people through stammering lips and a foreign tongue, and I'm going to lay a new cornerstone. Well, who quotes those verses? Well, Paul does. Jesus said, the gospel writers quote that Jesus is the stone that the builders rejected, but is actually the what? The cornerstone. And you sing a song about cornerstone pretty frequently. But what's the sign that the cornerstone that the builders rejected has become the chief cornerstone? and that the building that's going on is from God. What's the sign? Foreign tongues. Oh, when did that occur? On the day of Pentecost. On the day of, you go, well, that's a stretch. No, it isn't. This is the verse Paul quotes in 1 Corinthians 14 about tongues. And he says, tongues are a sign. A sign of what? Judgment. Judgment. The speaking in tongues in 1 Corinthians 14 was a sign of judgment. Now, I won't have time to go into this in detail this morning, but judgment on what? Judgment on who? Judgment on the same people, the same city that Isaiah is talking about, which was Jerusalem. The tongue speech going on in Jerusalem was a sign that that city was under judgment, it was about to be destroyed. God is speaking to us through stammering lips and foreign tongues. And if you're a Jewish person and you know Deuteronomy and you know Isaiah, and God's speaking to you through stammering lips and a foreign tongue, that means what? It means trouble. And that's why so many people on that day said, we need to what? We need to repent. We need to turn to the Lord. We need to come back to Him. So tongues are a sign. And that's all rooted back here in this language in Isaiah. But the foreign languages of Babel, going all the way back now to Genesis, this was the original tongue sign judgment. That's what it's about. So there's this tongue sign judgment happens on Babel. And Babylon becomes this place that is always viewed as the center of rebellion against God. So if you want to think of a society or a culture which is rising up against God, moving against God's purpose, think about that. We want to build this tower to keep us from being what? Spread abroad. Well, no, wait a minute. What's the Great Commission? Go. Get out of here. Right? Go. Okay. Man is always trying to go contrary to God. Instead of going, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth. Man says what? No, we'll just stay right here. We'll build our thing. All right. We'll make a name for ourselves. But what is God's agenda? Not to us, but to your name you give glory. It's the only name under heaven by which we can be saved. It's all about that name. We'll make it all out of bricks. But what does God build with? Stones. You are living stones. So everything about Babylon is contrary to the will and the purpose of God. It's arrogance, it's immorality. What was the purpose of the ziggurat? It was to go up and to practice astrology. Why practice astrology? Astrological, not astronomical, astrological, all right, not astronomical observation, scientific observation, but the purpose was, in their view, to worship false gods and to derive from the movement of the heavenly bodies guidance. Now, the problem that the Babylonians faced in terms of heavenly guidance from the stars and the moon and the sun is that God says at the end of Isaiah 13, we can go back over there now, they're all going to fall down. Now, in other words, all the lights are going to go out. All your places that you thought you were going to get guidance from, I'm turning the lights out on those things. Because that's the second sign for them. Now, I've listed several passages in here under Babylon as a sign that you can look at, including, especially, by the way, the passages in the book of Revelation that point out Babylon as a sign. But let's go now in Isaiah 13 to that latter section. Let's come back over there, Isaiah 13, and look at the language of the collapsing universe. Because this is something which shows up again in numerous places. Look at verse 6. Wail, for the day of the Lord is near. It will come as destruction from the Almighty. All right, what does that look like? The day of the Lord is coming, verse 9. All right, the land will become desolate. Verse 10, the stars of heaven and their constellations. Again, what was Babylonian worship like? Let's go up and get our guidance from the stars. So God begins to address that right away. They will not flash forth their light. The sun will go dark when it rises, and the moon will not give its light. Now, if you flip over a few pages again, to chapter 24. Let's go back over there for just a second. Chapter 24, verse 1. Listen to that again. The Lord lays the earth waste. He devastates it. He distorts its surface and scatters its inhabitants. And again, verse 3, the earth will be laid waste and completely despoiled. The earth will be formless and void. Decreation. The sun and the moon and the stars, what happens to their light? It goes out. What happens to the earth? It decreates. All right? So this is the language of reversal of creation. The sun, the moon, the stars, their light is going out. Why does Isaiah use the language of stars and moon and sun and earth in terms of judgment words? Well, we need to understand the purpose of each of these. In Genesis chapter 1, let's turn over there. I think this is an important verse to look at. Let's go back to the book of Genesis 1 is always easy to find. So you don't have to worry too much about it. So in Genesis chapter 1, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God's moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. So the light was good. God separated the light and the darkness. He called the light day, the darkness he called night, evening, morning, one day. So then God makes the expanse, and the waters above and the waters below, second day, and then he puts the land in reference to the earth. He gathers the water together into seas, and so on. And on the earth, he brings forth vegetation from the ground. That's the third day. What is the day on which things come out of the ground? Third day. Ah. Oh, see? See, told you. Okay. So Jesus said, unless a grain of wheat falls into the ground and dies, it abides alone, but if it dies, it bears much fruit. Talking about what there in John chapter 12? His own resurrection. He compares his resurrection to a seed bearing fruit and coming out of the ground, which in Genesis always happens on the third day. All right. So all of that, so the language, remember Genesis 1 is a song. Genesis 1 is a poem. It's a giant poem, song of the days of creation. And the way it works is this. The first 3 days create the structures. And then the second 3 days fill the structures. It's like building a house and then filling it with furniture, right? And inhabitants. The right inhabitants for it. So we create the environments first and then put stuff in it. So I'll just pause here and chase a rabbit for a minute. Environments matter. Environments matter. Environments and those who inhabit them have a relationship. God, and that's the way God established it. He established beautiful environments, perfect environments, if we could put it this way, cordial environments, which were suited to that which would go in them. God didn't make first a fish and then go, where are we going to put this thing? Right? What did he do first? He made the seas, and then he went, let's put fish in there. So he made the environment first, and then he placed the creature in it. He makes the earth, and then he puts on the last day, what's on day 6? Man, right? And beasts, right? But man and beast both are associated with which day? 6th day. That's why when man behaves like a beast, his number is 666. All right? So it's all tied back in here, okay? So man's a 6th day creature, and so are the animals. But God makes the environment first. He makes the environment first, and then he puts the creature that's appropriate to the environment. So when you'll hear people say, well, environments don't matter. Well, yeah, they do matter. They do. And those of you who, I bet you don't say that about your home. You don't say that about your kitchen. No, it doesn't matter. There's something dead and rotten in the pantry, but it doesn't matter. It's all right. We'll just leave it. Not at all. So what's going on here with the stars? Well, what's the purpose of them? Verse 14. Look at Genesis 1, verse 14. Now we're on a 4th day, so we're going to put stuff in the sky. What does God put up in the sky? Let there be lights in the expanse of the heavens to separate the day from the night. Let them be for signs. Oh, Signs. The stuff up in the sky is sent by God to be a sign. It's sign language. What's it a sign of? There to be signs for seasons and days and years. Let them be for lights in the expanse of the earth, or the heavens, to give light on the earth. And it was so. God made two great lights. The greater light to, say the next word with me, govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. And he made the stars also. Stars, heavenly bodies, do three things. They give light on the earth. They're signs, and they're signs particularly of governance. Now think about that for just a second. Stars, moon, and sun. How many flags are they on? Why do we use stars and moons and suns on our flags of all nations? Why do we do that? Why do we do that? Why have humans always done that? Because they're signs of what? Government. They're signs of governance. How do we identify, how do we identify our states? Stars, what's on Japan's flag? It's a rising sun. What's on almost every Islamic nation's flag? It's a crescent moon with a star, all right? So this has always been the case down through human history. We use these things as signs of governance. This is our kingdom. This is who we are. This identifies who we are. We're lights that govern. All right, so these have always been signs of governance. So there's literal government going on from the moon, because the way in which the moon interacts with our globe creates what? Forces of gravity and tide and so on. It's highly governmental, right? So it's not unusual that people pick these up. So here's the thing. You can go back now to Isaiah, but in the text of Isaiah and in the rest of the Bible, when God begins to talk about the fall of rulers, how does he do it? He talks about it with stars falling and suns going out. And he refers to certain rulers as morning stars. And then they fall. So when God says through a prophet, the stars are going to fall from the sky, and the moon's going to go out, and the sun isn't going to shine, is he saying that literally stars are going to fall down out of the sky? Or is he saying that governments are going to collapse? Governments are collapsing. That ruler is coming down. That power will be no more. This is the prophetic imagination. The prophetic imagination takes the created order and understands it as sign language and uses it. It employs it. The sun is going to go out. The stars are going to fall. The moon is going to collapse. All of this is going to go down because of this judgment which is coming upon the earth. These governments and these powers will be no more. Now that's important for us to understand, because the heavens tell a story. Again, it's sign language. Listen to Psalm 19. The heavens are telling the glory of God. Psalm 19. Day to day pours forth speech. Night to night reveals knowledge. There is no sound, but their word goes forth across the earth. So the sun and the moon and the stars tell a story. They tell a story. It's such a powerful story, but sometimes God can say, that's it for this chapter. And when that happens, how does he describe it? Well, look over in Revelation chapter 6. Let's go over to the book of Revelation for just a moment. Revelation chapter 6. Revelation 6, verse 12. I looked, and when he broke the sixth seal, there was a great earthquake. The sun became as black as sackcloth made of hair, and the whole moon became like blood. And the stars of the sky fell to the earth as a fig tree casts its unripe figs when shaken by a great wind. The sky was split apart like when it is rolled up. And every mountain and island were moved out of their places. You'll read on the book of Revelation, the sky is a what? A scroll. And what does God do with it? He rolls it up and he puts it away. What are the heavens above us? They're a what? They're a scroll. And they tell a story. They have a language. It's a sign language. And human beings have been very aware of it. And it tells the glory. But when a particular land or nation or empire or ruler, when its time is up, guess what happens to its stars? What happens to its moons? What happens to its sun? It does what? It goes out. And so, on a Friday afternoon, the Son of God hung on a cross between heaven and earth. And the earth quaked. And what happened to the sun? It went out. And when he died, what happened to the veil in the temple? It was torn in two. What is God saying to Jerusalem? It's over. Your time is up. The lights are out. This is the beginning of the demolition of Jerusalem. Now, it took 40 years to finally take place. The Romans finally took it down. But that's in fulfillment of the prophecy that Jesus gave. He said, everything will come upon this generation. A biblical generation's 40 years. Within 40 years of his prophecy about Jerusalem being destroyed, it was. But the indication was that for a brief period of hours, the sun went out. And every person standing in Jerusalem, when the earth quaked and the sun went out, went, Isaiah. The universe is collapsing. What does that mean? It means that the day of judgment, the day of the Lord, has come. So, and then came tongue judgments. Then foreign tongues started being spoken in Jerusalem. And dead people were seen walking around in the streets. See, if you lived in Jerusalem at that time and you saw dead people come out of graves and start walking around the street, and there was an earthquake, and the sun went out. Think about it. You think it's the end of the world because the Cubs and the Indians are in the World Series. But if you were a person living in Jerusalem at that time, and the earth quaked, and the dead rose, and the sun went out, and people started speaking foreign tongues, you would be convinced you were living at what? The end. And you'd be right. But it wasn't the end of history. It was the end of Jerusalem, and that chapter, and a new chapter, was beginning. So this is all part of the prophetic imagination. Now let's look at Isaiah 20. Just a couple of other things on this, okay? Before we got to wrap up. Here, we got a couple of minutes, though, don't we? We're okay. Isaiah 20. Now, not only is Babylon a sign, and not only is the created order a sign, Isaiah is himself a sign. I don't want you to miss this chapter. Isaiah 20. In the year that the commander came to Ashdod, when Sargon, the king of Assyria, sent him, and he fought against Ashdod and captured it. At that time, the Lord spoke through Isaiah, the son of Amos, saying, "Go and loosen the sackcloth from your hips, and take your shoes off your feet." And he did so, going about naked and barefoot. How about that? Now, see, you already, how many appreciate Isaiah's commission was already tough enough? Remember that early on? Who can we send? I'll go. We'll go and have no success. Great. That's wonderful. How long? Until everything's judged. Fantastic. Now God comes to Isaiah and says, I want you to walk around naked. Great. Great. Barefoot and naked. And the Lord said, even as my servant Isaiah has gone naked and barefoot 3 years as a sign and a token against Egypt and Cush, so the king of Assyria will lead away the captives of Egypt and the exiles of Cush, young and old, naked and barefoot with buttocks uncovered, to the shame of Egypt. I see that's literally in the Bible, showing your butt. All right? It's right there. Okay? You can just claim that verse from now and put that on your fridge. Okay? Don't show your butt. Isaiah 20. Okay? Why? All right? Well, what's that a sign of? It's a sign that they've been taken captive and made slaves. You strip them down. You publicly shame individuals to bring them down from whatever station they may have held in their former society. We are now publicly shaming you to strip away any dignity that you have. We're assigning to you a new position. All right, so you're going to walk around the Middle East, all right, the Middle East, naked and barefoot. Now, listen, I just lived in Texas, and that's as close to the Middle East as I really want to get in terms of climate, and I wouldn't want to walk around naked and barefoot down there because there's all kinds of not only brutal sun, but there's also interesting creatures running about the place down on the ground. Anna was excited about moving up here because she knew she could run around barefoot again. You could never go barefoot in Texas because you would run into all kinds of fun little interesting things, like scorpions. I found one in the netting of my swimsuit one time. But my swimsuit was on when I discovered it. I'll say no more about that. Now, it's what Isaiah is saying is that there is shame coming. There's shame coming. So it's shamed as a captive. I've got a typo on my notes. It may be on yours too. I don't know, but it's shamed. It's not a tricky Hebrew word there if it's not been corrected. All right, so it's shamed. So what is Isaiah doing? Here's the point, and I don't want us to miss this. Listen to what Isaiah said about his children. Behold, I and the sons that God has given me are for signs. Now, Isaiah is a sign, and the way he dresses is a sign. Or undresses, as the case may be. He is a sign. Now, here's why this is important. How many of you are prophetic people? Yes, the Spirit of the Lord is with you, which makes you a what? You are a prophetic people. That makes you a sign. A sign. I'm telling you that part of the role of prophetic people is to be signs. Paul uses a different image when he says we are living epistles. It's a different image. You're a living letter that God, by His Spirit, is writing. So the way we live, the way we dress, everything about us is a sign. It's indicative. And it always matters. So don't lose sight of this, that the prophet, the minister, and the people can themselves be signs. Then finally, Isaiah 27. And this serpent as sign. Let's look over there. Isaiah 27, the serpent as sign. In that day, the Lord will punish Leviathan, the fleeing serpent, and his fierce and great and mighty, with his fierce and great and mighty sword, even Leviathan, the twisted serpent. Leviathan means sea monster. The twisted serpent. He will kill the dragon who lives in the sea. Now, the name of this is Rahab. In Near Eastern mythology, Baal, who was the master god of the earth, conquered the sea god, a seven-headed dragon. So when Isaiah picks up this imagery here, he's using very common, well-known mythological figures. This was common mythology in the ancient Near Eastern world. Baal, the earth god, Leviathan, the sea god, the dragon, a seven-headed dragon. And what Isaiah does is he picks up on this very picturesque language, this myth. He uses mythic language to tell a truth, which is that the dragon will be destroyed by the Lord, that God is the true one who uses his sword to pierce the dragon. And this kind of language is not the only place this appears in the book of Isaiah. We go over to Isaiah 51, verse 9. Isaiah 51, verse 9. Let's turn over there. And you'll see how this comes up again about the power of God over the seas and over the darkness of the seas. In Isaiah 51, let's pick it up in verse 9. Isaiah 51, verse 9. Awake, awake, put on strength, O arm of the Lord. Awake as in the days of old, the generation of long ago. Was it not you, O Lord, who cut Rahab in pieces, who pierced the dragon? All right? So there's Rahab, that's the name, of this mythic seven-headed sea monster. And God says, I'm the one who pierces it. And Isaiah is saying, Lord, wasn't that you that did that? When? When? Was it not you who dried up the sea, the waters of the great deep, who made the depths of the sea a pathway for the redeemed to cross over? Oh, wait a minute. When did God dry up the sea so that the redeemed could go through it? That's Exodus, right? That's okay. So, he says, the ransomed of the Lord will return and come with joyful shouting to Zion, and everlasting joy will be on their heads, and so on. In other words, Isaiah 51 prophesies a new Exodus. The language that Isaiah prophesies about this new and coming Exodus, this greater Exodus that's coming, this greater restoration, is that once again, God will take the dragon and destroy him. Rahab, the dragon. Now, this is important for us, and I've mentioned this a little bit, just kind of in passing on a Sunday morning, I think. You and I enjoy going to the beach. We think of the ocean as something wonderful, pleasurable, it's refreshing to us and renewing for us, but the Jewish people did not see it that way. They saw the ocean and the seas as the place of the Gentiles, the place of darkness. And this goes all the way back to Genesis. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. And the word that's used for the deep is this: the abyss. The abyss. Now, when you and I hear about the abyss, we don't think just about the depths of the sea. We think the place of darkness. Darkness was over the abyss. So it's important for us to think about, in their imagination, as they view reality, they view the seas, they view the oceans, they view it, and Isaiah uses this language, the tossing of the waves are like the wicked, right? And the Gentile powers are compared to coming up out of the sea. That happens in the book of Revelation 2. Let's look over at Revelation now, chapter 12 and 13. And we'll close over here. In Revelation chapter 12, by the way, what did that dragon look like? What was Rahab? It's a dragon that lived in the sea, and what did it look like? 7 heads. Oh, okay. Chapter 12, verse 1. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars, and she was with child, and she cried out, being in labor and in pain to give birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon having 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his head were 7 crowns, and his tail swept away 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she gave birth, he might devour the child. So here's the dragon wants to devour the child that's born. She gave birth to a son, a male child who's to rule the nations with a rod of iron. Her child was caught up to God and to his throne. The woman goes into the wilderness where she had a place prepared by God so that there she would be nourished for 1,260 days and so on. Then there's a war in heaven between Michael and the dragon. And the dragon is overcome. What happens to the dragon? Well, the dragon comes down to the earth. We won't go through all of that, but look at chapter 13, verse 1. The dragon, having been defeated, stood on the sand of the seashore. And I saw a beast coming up out of the sea, having 10 horns and 7 heads, and on his horns were 10 diadems, and his heads were blasphemous names. So this beast that comes up out of the ocean looks a lot like the dragon who's standing on the shore. It's got 7 heads as well. It's got crowns on his heads. And the beast that I saw was like a leopard and so on. And I saw one of his heads, verse 4, as if it had been slain and so on. And then verse 4, and they worshipped the dragon. So there is this whole interplay in the book of Revelation between the dragon. But what happens ultimately to the dragon? Well, the dragon is identified with, this brings us back full circle, to Babylon and its power. And what happens to Babylon? It is destroyed. And it's destroyed by the son of the woman who is born. This woman gives birth to a son, and he ultimately destroys the dragon and the beast from the earth as well. And Babylon is overthrown. So the victory of the son and the woman over the serpent is critical. Because why would the Bible talk about a son being born to a woman, and they overcome a serpent. Because what happens at the very beginning of the story of the Bible? There's a woman. And who comes and has a conversation with her? A serpent. And the Lord prophesies to her in redemption, and he says, you're going to give birth to a son, and the serpent will bruise his heel, but he will do what? Crush your head. And so all of this imagination is very powerful stuff, and the language of Isaiah is rooted in Genesis, and the language of Revelation is rooted in Isaiah. So the serpent language, the dragon language, Babylon language, all of that ties together as the places of God's power. You go, well, which is it? Is it earthly power, or is it demonic power? Oh, I'm so glad you asked. Because next week we'll turn to that, to the relationship between heavenly powers that are dark and earthly governments that are here. And there is a connection. All right, we'll stop there. What sort of comments or questions have you got there? Yeah, sir?
Do you think Isaiah was really naked, or was he just shamed in his prophecies?
I think he was not fully naked. Most commentators say that he was probably, for a period of time during a day, he exposed his buttocks. That he had his robe was lifted there to expose his backside. That's what most commentators think. But I don't have any idea. Yeah. Great question, though. Yeah, that's right. Others? Okay, so here's one of the fun things, guys. Again, just our study of Isaiah. What Isaiah does is he does all this stuff reaching back in order to point forward. And so one of the things you can do with this section of Isaiah is you're reading it because it's kind of baffling. You're reading about Moab and Tyre, and you're going, what? All right, don't worry so much about that per se. You should believe in the Bible from Genesis to maps. You can go back and look them up. Okay, that's all fine. But as you soak in these chapters, let the prophetic imagination fill you. Now that I've introduced some of that sign language to you, go back and reread it and go, where's the sign? Where constellations, stars, sun, the relationship between the morning star and earthly powers? How's that all working out? Just kind of think it through in those terms. All right. Well, there's time now for your study groups. Let me pray for us as we go. Father, thank you for this time together this morning. We trust ourselves to you, and we thank you for the prophetic imagination. Fill our hearts and minds with this same worldview. And we pray in Jesus' name. Amen.